This is a video on how to replace the axle. The first thing you're going to do is lower the main body onto the footboard as if you were folding it into standby. Latch it into place. And now what we're going to do is we're going to leave the wheels up here in this position, and we're simply going to flip the go onto a softer surface. I'm using some foam here that I'm just going to turn this upside down and then set my go down on a nice soft surface. You can use a blanket or something of the sort. Okay, next, once you have the go upside down and on a soft surface with the wheels facing up and the rear axle facing up, we're going to take the wheels off. So one at a time, I'm going to remove the hubcap, and you can use the wrench provided or your own ratchet wrench for more rapid removal. So and these nuts will probably be on pretty tight. Make sure you save all parts. There's a little washer, a little spacer that comes off right after the nut, and then the fender is going to be the next. And so here you're going to want to get a little leverage here to be able to loosen. That came off pretty quick. To loosen the fender off of its position here on the axle, and then the whole assembly comes off, and you will have this part that might slip out, which is simply a spacer that is in between the wheel and the fender. So I'll point those out when we reassemble it at the end. That's just a part to keep in mind that you want to keep it in there in the mix. Just keep the whole assembly, set it off to the side. Now we're going to repeat it on the other side. So I've already taken off the hubcap, and we're going to repeat this on this side. Again, being mindful of that washer, set it off to the side. And so here I'll try to do this more delicately this time. Just get a little leverage behind and wiggle the fender so that it comes off. And then you can kind of keep the whole thing together as you slide it off the axle. There you go. Now, next step, there's a little Allen bolt that runs through, and for this step you're going to need your Allen key. That is a 7/32 measurement, and a pair of pliers to hold the hex bolt that's on the other end. So here, again, you're going to loosen this while you hold on to the bolt on the other end, and just go all the way with it until the bolt comes off. So here's the bolt. Set it aside. Now here, this Allen, sorry, that's the nut. Now the Allen bolt might require a little tap to come out. So use a hammer and gently tap it out until it comes loose. You can use your pliers here again. There you go. Okay. Now the next step is going to be to remove these two nuts off of these down bolts that are where the suspension is located. So again, we're going to take the same wrench, or if you have a ratchet wrench that is going to function better for you and be a quicker process. But here again, I'm trying to use just the tools that are provided. So I'm not going to take it all the way off because the springs are giving some resistance to the axle. Alright, now I have both of them nice and loose. And these are lock nuts, as you can see here. So set those aside. They're the same ones that go on the wheels, but I like to keep everything separate. Now here finally you're just going to lift the axle, being careful with these dampeners. Maybe you should take the dampeners off first and keep the washer. There's another spacer that sits directly on top of these rubber dampeners that are below the nuts. So keep those. So as you can see, there's the washer sitting on top of the axle. So discard your old axle, and now we're going to talk about how to replace it in this next segment. Now this is how to reassemble the axle and the wheels. So again, here is your axle, and you're going to see a left and a right designation here on the back, L and R, with an arrow pointing backwards. And in the same position, you are going to mount it with the arrow facing down, assuming you haven't moved your go from its position. Down towards the front wheel, and the right R side of the axle is going to be facing you and on the side of the power button on your go, and the L is going to be on the side of the USB port. Okay, don't flip it around with the letters facing the springs. Face away from the springs and slide them directly onto the down bolts. Next, you're going to take the rubber dampener and the washer, the spacer that sits on top of it, and slide one each onto the bolts sitting directly on top of the axle. So same thing with this one. I got my washer that jumped off earlier, and we're going to set it down there. So once you've got your dampeners and washer sitting directly on top, you're going to take your nuts, the lock nuts, and thread them on to the down bolts here. Get them started. And then finish it up with your wrench, ratchet if you prefer. Now, the degree to which you tighten these nuts and compress the springs, right, these are your rear suspension springs, is going to determine the stiffness of your footboard when you're riding. So the looser you keep them, the more play you will have in the footboard and the more kind of performance it will be. And if you enjoy kind of loose trucks on a skateboard, if you're a skater, that's going to be a good call for you. But if you prefer having more stability when you're at a standstill, you're going to want to tighten them quite a bit to have a lot of stiffness. Again, when the go is on its 3 wheels, you can always adjust this setting and the stiffness of your footboard with the wrench itself. So once we have that sufficiently compressed to line up this hole here with this archway, this is where our Allen bolt is going to thread right through, the one that we had to hammer out to remove. So here it's going to be a similar situation. It might be a little tough to get through there, so gently find the alignment. Find the alignment with the hole, and then you can just tap it through. Here we go. I'm through. And I'm going to take the small nut, and then again we're going to use a wrench on one side and an Allen key on the other. Maybe I'll pivot this around a little bit so you can have a better perspective of what I'm doing. Tilt it a little bit. So here's the nut on the other side, and I've got my Allen key here. So we're going to tighten this all the way. Oops, sorry about that. Now you do want to get this nice and snug. Okay, now we're ready to put the wheels back on. Now for the wheels, you're going to notice that the fenders each bear on the clip that's on the inside, that's going to mount on the inside of the axle, an R or an L. So you're going to match that up with the R and the L that's on the axle, and you're going to slide the part that has the R on it in first, with the wheel following behind it. And then again, if this spacer has loosened, you're going to put the rounded part, the longer rounded part, towards the wheel itself. Here it is. And the fender is going to sort of clip onto it on the outside. So the easiest way to tell if you're properly lined up with respect to the fender is if this hard plastic portion is basically parallel with the body of the Go, and if you try to pivot the rubber part of the fender into its two separate positions, you are on the lower side of the wheel, never coming up above the wheel itself. So again, this plastic portion of the clip needs to be facing up towards the ceiling. Now, to secure the wheel, you are going to take the spacer that belongs on the outside of the wheel cover of the fender here, and then follow that up with the lock nut, and again tighten this with your handy wrench. Until you meet a good amount of resistance, and you definitely want to make sure that the wheel is freely moving and isn't being blocked by anything. Lastly, you're going to cover it up with your hubcap. If you want to put a little bit of glue on there so that you can secure your hubcap before you apply, that some silicone type glue would be great. Nothing too drastic, so that if you do have to remove it, it will come off. There is already a little bit of silicone glue, but you will have broken that seal when you remove it. So we're going to repeat this on the other side now. Once again, I'm going to look at my fender. I'm going to find that L that's seen right here, and we're going to go ahead and position it so that this clip is again facing up towards the ceiling. Thread it first, the fender onto the axle, followed by the wheel. There we go. And then lastly, we have the spacer and the last portion of the fender. So it takes a little bit of wiggling, and then you'll be able to know that you're in the right place with the fender if the plastic clip cannot be moved. So if you're secure here, you're good. If you're still able to freely move the fender around, you're not on the right spot. So again, find the right positioning, and then really ensure that you push the wheel and the rest of the assembly all the way onto the axle before putting the nut on. So again, I'm going to take my washer, put it on the outside, and follow that up with the lock nut. And my wrench. See there, I tightened it too much, so I'm going to get a little resistance when I spin the wheel. So maybe just a smidge looser on the bolt until I find a nice, there we go, much better. All right, and then I'm going to cover it up with the hubcap. So and finally, once you're done with that, you're going to just take your axle and flip it back towards the front wheel, and you might encounter this power assist position. And again, do not force this because that will break this hinge housing here. You're going to use the trigger latch, see, to release the pivot here in that hinge, and then bring it all the way back to standby mode. And then you can use a luggage handle to lift up your unit and set it in standing position.